You're listening to the Sunny Days Podcast. I'm your host, Alex the Good Witch, a professional psychic, healer, and coach specializing in subconscious reprogramming, inner child work, and intuition development to help you create your happiest, most fulfilling life. Thank you for tuning in on this sunny day. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Sunny Days Podcast. I am your host, Alex the Good Witch, and today I have a special guest with me, Liv Moore. She is an alternative pagan officiant. So I'll let her introduce herself to you and let you know a little bit about who she is and what that means.
Thank you for the introduction, Alex. Yeah, I do. I use a couple different words. I like the word alternative because I feel like it kind of encourages my people to find me, people that are not necessarily the norm. But I do consider myself a pagan or spiritualist wedding officiant. So I specialize in ceremonies that are for people that are on a pagan or spiritualist path. And I really got into that because when I was getting married, there wasn't anybody who did that, right? You discovered the same thing, Alex. If you're not part of a coven, if you're not part of a clan, then you kind of have nobody to marry you in your path. So that's really how I got into it, and it's been such a joy.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, you mentioned a little bit of how we met. So we actually did meet because Liv was me and Rob's officiant for our wedding, and we were looking into. Well, it's so interesting how much it was just so aligned. And I feel like this is how I'm sure all of your clients feel, is that Rob had mentioned a while ago when we were first planning the wedding that he really wanted an officiant to like get to know us and be very spiritual and have like a ceremony that was really tailored for us, and like words that were tailored from getting to know us, and having like a spiritual ceremony that was unique and aligned with our intentions. And I was like, yeah, that sounds really cool. And like you mentioned, a lot of times you can only find this maybe in like organizations. So he had gotten the idea because we had gone to a wedding, and the person officiating, my cousin, like had gotten to know them. They had kind of like these sessions with each other before, so the vows were like very personal. But he's a Christian pastor, and like we don't or pastor, and we don't resonate with that.
Yeah.
So I was looking into spiritual officiants, and they were very hard to come by. And then you would come by them and it would seem like maybe they're not even around anymore. Like it was just like, wow, it was a lot trickier than I thought. And then I went to Handy Dandy Instagram and I found Liv and just loved everything about her. It wasn't like before where it was like, oh my gosh, is there anybody? Because we wanted the person to resonate with us as well. And like I got to Liv and I showed Rob Liv, and we're both like, she is amazing. We love what she does. And we're like, she lives in Colorado. We'll ask her if she can come to California. Like, we want this person. And that's how we met. And she came out and officiated our wedding.
It was so much fun too. I have to tell you, of all the weddings I've done, you are the first and only beach wedding. Um,
Wow.
yes, I think I have a couple coming up this year, but
Hmm.
you guys were the first, so you'll already
Yeah.
have that.
Hmm.
And I just loved how much you guys wanted to make the ceremony, like you said, intentional, but very like romantically intimate as well. Like you even
Hmm.
took moments away from me to
Hmm.
say, do your personal vows with the ocean. And I loved how much thought you guys had put into it. And it was easy to resonate with you from the get-go because
Hmm.
you could see that the ceremony was an important part of the day, which
Hmm.
oftentimes it gets overlooked, right? It gets treated
Yeah.
as maybe the more like boring part of the day, or the part that
Hmm.
we don't want to connect to as much. But you guys, from the very, very first chat, you were like, this is the most important thing for us on our wedding
Hmm.
day. It has to be XYZ. I know Rob was very good at
Hmm.
laying out things directly of what he wanted. And it was just so easy to connect because of that.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. Yeah, it's so true because, and I know you have this point of view, is that the ceremony is really like it's a ritual. That's what the ceremony is, regardless of what your like spiritual preferences are. It is like this it is a ceremony, literally. And I feel like it does get very overlooked. Like you said, maybe like the boring part or like the long drawn out part, not the fun like dancing at the end. But I think it's such an opportunity to make it really resonate with you and not just be for everybody else. So I'd love to hear about kind of like all the different ways that you make the ceremony about the couple, because I know how you made our ceremony, but I know that your ceremonies look so different couple to couple. You are not a one size fits all, like, oh, here's some cool spiritual things. I've seen pictures of you like in all kinds of outfits and things like that. So I'd love to hear more.
Yeah,
Mhm.
absolutely. It's been such a fun way to embrace the fact that I'm a different person every day that I wake up, because each of
Mhm.
my couples is a different person, and they're different people, and they're bringing me different love stories. And so, like you said, it's for me, the goal is to get to know you, to reflect your love story. And you'll hear me say that a lot, that I'm about celebrating individual love stories,
Mhm.
because I don't believe that one ceremony fits all. And you get that a lot in religious, and you even get that in non-denominational and
Mhm.
secular ceremonies, where you kind of end up with the same droning metaphor over and over
Mhm.
again. And so what I've constructed instead is actually using the fact that I have always wanted to be a journalist. My life
Mhm.
goal was to work for National Geographic,
Mhm.
and I love the energy of journalism because I think that it requires you to look deeper than what you're given, to tell
Mhm.
a story that might not have been seen, which is kind of what I do with my couples. I did that definitely with the two of you as well, really kind of asking questions that I felt would force you guys in directions of depth
Mhm.
that would show the meaning and the intention of the relationship
Mhm.
that you may not have even considered before. And so,
Yeah.
yeah, that really does lend to every single ceremony is different, right?
Mhm.
Because every single love story is different.
Mhm.
And yeah, I've had a lot of fun. I've had couples that were having like a Halloween wedding and wanted me to dress in garb for that. I do a lot of Ausa True weddings, which is the Norse weddings, so I dress in
Mhm.
full garb for that as well. But then, of course, you guys and your whole vibe was everything. So I got to embrace that.
Mhm.
And it wasn't just visually, right? Like the energy I tried to embrace with your ceremony too was the overall like attention to love and peace that we
Mhm.
see woven throughout the era that you
Mhm.
attach yourself to. And I wanted your script to reflect that energy as well. So that's really kind of the goal for me, is to find something that's kind of like the little seed at the root, I guess you will, of the tree
Mhm.
of your relationship. And
Yeah.
in a lot of cases, my couples have never even thought about it. So that's
Mhm.
fun too.
Yeah, it very much reflects the energy of the couple, like in relationships there's two individuals, but there's that third entity, which is the relationship itself. And I feel like you through like your questions and everything, and like how you like that journalism piece of like going deeper and being able to express that really reflects back kind of like who or what that third entity is for people. And something that's really cool too is that, like you mentioned, all these different kinds of wedding based on love stories, but also based on different practices, different like spiritual ideologies and cultures, and things of that nature. So I would love to learn more from you. I know that you have like an education in this, and I love all of your facts that you post on Instagram. It's amazing because it's a lot of things that really get buried with just like the very dominant Christian culture.
Yeah.
So not to put you on the spot because I don't have any specific questions with that, but if there's any cool, like interesting facts that you would like to share, I just love them.
Absolutely. So something that I actually will hear a lot from usually moms and dads or grandparents at weddings is that it was weird. It was a strange experience for them because they're used to, quote, a more traditional wedding.
Hmm.
And this is one of my favorite things that people will say to me, because they're opening a door to knowledge here. The concept that we have with traditional weddings in the United States specifically, because this is very United States specific. If you go across the
Hmm.
pond, it's not so much that case. But the concept we have here when we're talking about traditional is we're talking about Christian. Um,
Hmm.
we also have akin the word religion to Christian as well. When people will meet with me
Hmm.
and they say we're not really religious, what they mean is they're not Christian. um,
Yeah.
because I'm religious. I'm
Hmm.
just religious as a pagan. right?
Mm.
So for starters, that's been an interesting journey. You're right, my education is in religion. So I
Mhm.
have a degree in religious history, mythology, and symbology.
Mhm.
And the joke I like to make with people is if you ever saw the Da Vinci Code, Robert Langdon, I wanted to be that guy.
Yeah.
um, until the world is ending, there
Uh-huh.
is no need for me, so I will marry people.
You have to find a job until you got hired
Yeah,
for,
pretty
yeah.
much. This is like until they need me. So no, I'm
Yeah.
just kidding. No, this has been a really unique way to use that education and study. Other than becoming a professor, there's not a lot you can do with that study.
Mm.
But what this has done for me, with allowing me to use my education in religions is to even connect people who are attached to said religions back to the roots they may not know. Because I
Mm.
have couples that I'm blending ceremonies for. For example, I have a witch that I'm marrying here in April who's marrying a Hindu man. He's from India.
Mhm.
And he even doesn't know a lot of his own traditions because he's grown up in the highly Christianized society of the US. So he
Mhm.
doesn't connect to them and he doesn't know what they mean. And so I've been able to take both of their traditions that come from, roots and ancestors and connect them back to them and then work it into their wedding ceremony as well.
Wow.
And something that they've brought to light is that there's actually not a huge difference when you start getting to the root of these religions
Mm.
in the ceremonial practice, which is probably one of my favorite things about what I do is kind of opening people's eyes to the fact that we all come from like a root of connectivity. And
Yeah.
so these different traditions that we're connecting to, they're really just like various reflections of the same
Mhm.
image, right?
Mhm.
My favorite ones, which I guess that's not fair to choose a favorite, but my favorite ones for sure are couples that are not afraid to fully embrace a tradition or a ritual, even
Mhm.
if they have family members present who are of a different
Mm.
religion, which of course we're pointing to Christianity there.
Yeah.
But that being said, I do try to be very conscious. Like you mentioned my Instagram, I talk a lot about different pagan traditions, and I try to be very conscious about the fact that most people don't even know what the word pagan means.
Mhm.
So you kind of have to start with the ground up there, and just educate people on pagan is just anything that's not from an Abrahamic religion. It's not Christian, it's not Islamic, it's not Jewish.
Mhm.
So really for me the thing is kind of giving a voice to the voiceless there, representing all of the other religious traditions that gave root to that. Did I answer
Yeah.
your question? Because I kind of feel like I went a little off there.
Oh my gosh, no, I loved all of it. I loved it. It did. It gave me interesting facts. I love that you're talking about the roots, like how a lot of times we will be like, "Oh wow, this feels very similar." Like even though we thought of them as like separate traditions or religions, but like when you get down to the root of it, it feels like very similar intentions really, like of what you are doing like in this marriage ceremony and how you are reflecting like this union.
Yeah. Well, and,
Mhm.
and something I like to point out, as you know, the hand fasting is probably what I'm most known for. And something
Mhm.
I like to point out with the hand fasting too is that that is a tradition that we see versions of all around the world. There are, for example, lasso and blanket ceremonies that come from
Mhm.
Indigenous America. I can't pronounce it, but there's one they do in India as well. That's
Mhm.
part of the Hindu wedding tradition where they tie a knot. So the whole tying of the knot is something we can see kind of across the world, and especially too we see it kind of woven throughout the scripture of the three is stronger than one, right? So
Mhm. Mhm.
like these traditions, they unite us, which is
Yeah.
why I like to connect people to them, because I feel like especially when it comes to our wedding, so often
Mhm.
couples go into a wedding and they're trying to make everything about it so personal and they're trying to connect
Mhm.
to it, and then they get to their ceremony and they feel like they're just kind of left with, well, we either have like our cousin do it or
Mhm.
we find a non-denominational, or just to make my mom happy we'll hire the pastor. So
Yeah.
I'm trying to give people access to like still connecting with their ceremony as well. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and having it be like everything it's such like a magical moment, truly, regardless of like what denomination or non-denomination it is, it's a magical ceremony, and I feel like that it does get taken away, and like you said, sometimes it's just kind of a matter of going through the motions or the steps because that's all you know, that's all you've seen other people do, and you don't necessarily really not like it or resonate with it, but you're just
Yeah.
like, sure. Like we're
Yeah.
getting married. It's like, isn't this just what you do? And with that, I'd also love to hear, I know you've talked about, you mentioned here briefly about quote unquote traditional
Mhm.
and how it's not even rooted back to what truly traditional would mean. So I'd love to hear more about how that kind of veered off and turned into the traditions that we see today. And I feel like give kind of people permission if they feel like they don't really resonate with the traditions, but they're just going with it to kind of maybe see why they don't resonate with the traditions. Maybe deep down they kind of sense that it's not really in aligned with it with what's truly like at the root of these ceremonies.
Absolutely. That's an incredibly beautiful question. I'm going to try to answer it without giving you religious history 101. Um,
I kind of love it. I'm kind of down. I feel like the listeners will be too, but it's up to you, whatever you'd like to share.
well, and don't open that can of worms. 'Cause I used to
Mm.
be a teacher. um, so I think really what we're talking about here when people talk about not resonating with what we conceive as traditional is they're not resonating with the politicizing of religion.
Mm,
So when I talk about my ceremonies, I talk about them in a context of spell work or ritual, which you've definitely heard me say. I like to think of ceremony as us connecting to the intentional energy within ourselves and the divine energy, whether we see that as divine beyond us or divine coming through us. But what we're seeing with like this disconnect to traditional ceremony is that it has been pulled away from ritual, it has been pulled away from like divination, which is really what it was kind of at its core, and
mhm,
turned into, we talk about this a lot, of property exchange, but
mhm,
politicized property exchange, right?
mhm.
And I won't go crazy down that rabbit hole because I totally could. But there was definitely a shift. I mean, I don't want to blame everything on Christianity, right? Because I'm absolutely not a Christian hater. I think
Mhm,
it's a fantastic religion. I
mhm,
think this study of understanding that Yeshua went to the East and came back with Buddhism, and
mhm,
what he gave to the Jews was Buddhism, and that's where Christianity came from. I think that's incredible.
mhm,
However, unfortunately, during kind of the Mediterranean, really in the Mediterranean area during the medieval time, we see Christianity turning into this political tool that
mhm,
we're using to control large groups of people who are unhappy with their living status. And because of that, Christianity as a religion kind of loses its magic. And I do mean that
mhm.
MAGIK, magic, like
Yeah.
actually its practice, right?
Mhm,
Because Christianity itself was a cult following of a religion, and it originally did have a lot of mysticism woven into it.
mhm,
And those ceremonies that we would have practiced as early Christians getting married in the Mediterranean would have looked a lot like
mhm,
pagan ceremonies. You would
mm,
have been married by a priestess instead of a priest. The connection here is for the ancient people, those who had a womb were believed to be closer to the divine because they
mm,
could give
mhm.
birth, right? They could
Yeah.
create life. And so we would have been married by a priestess. This priestess typically would have married us somewhere out in the mountains or near a cave so that we could be close to the elements. They
Mhm,
would call to the divine. We would light a candle. Oftentimes we would wash our hands or our feet, which then becomes a very Christian symbol as well.
mhm.
So these sort of like ideas of traditional, they're not connecting all the way back to their root,
Yeah.
right? And if we parse through the last 2000 years of history and we go back to prior to this politicization of religion, we find that ceremony, that
Mhm.
ritual, that spell. And that's a word that I've been trying to attach a lot of what I do to lately, is this ceremonialist, connecting people to what is really the intention underneath all of that, and
Mhm.
how do we celebrate and embrace that, because there's very few things that we even do ceremony for anymore, so
Yeah.
yeah.
Wow, that's so interesting. I love how like traditional, the way that we see it now, it's not just about, like you said, Christianity. It's really the politicizing. Oh my
It's
gosh.
such a hard word to say,
Oh my
but yeah,
gosh.
the politicization of
Of Christianity, because if you go back to the true Christian roots, it would have been done in such a different, more connected spiritual wise way. And I know that you said how it started to turn into not just the politicization, but also like the transactional, and that's when we could get into, paying for a bride and the families and everything like that. And I remember one of your posts had all these interesting facts about why. we really do the things that we do, as far as like why the groomsmen are standing there and why all the
Yeah.
bridesmaids are dressed the same and things like that. Could you share some of those? Because I feel like it does such a justice of like really being able to contrast, like there is the Christianity in such a spiritual way, like this is a faith,
Yeah.
versus the politicized Christianity and how it turned into what we see as quote unquote traditional, but it's very removed. It's not very connected and divine and soulful.
No,
Mhm.
absolutely. That's a great word, soulful. I love that.
Mhm.
Um, no, and I do love to post about that. I call it the dark side of wedding traditions,
Mhm.
when we talk about how they came about and what they mean. And of course, there are some ancient societies. I don't want to sound like I'm saying that it all used to be spiritual. There are some ancient societies where it was kind of always a property exchange.
Mhm.
Marriage was, but we do see a lot of things that are reflected still in modern ceremonies that have those roots, and even some of them being, from our pagan cultures. But yeah, you mentioned the bridesmaids and the groomsmen is one of my favorite dark traditions to bring up. So, a lot of people don't realize this comes from the ancient Sumerian people. We do also see it in the Egyptians and kind of the whole area there of the Levant. But the idea is that you would, as a groom, you would choose your strongest soldiers, so the people who were part of your clan that you saw as the biggest baddies,
Mhm.
to stand with you when you were getting married. That way, if the bride's family last minute decided that your dowry wasn't good enough, or they didn't want you to marry their bride or whatever, they changed their mind and decided to take the bride back by force, you would have your strongest guys standing there with you to fight them off. So it's
They're
kind of
ready.
it's a little messed up.
Mhm.
And the reflection of that on the bride's side is that traditionally all of the bridesmaids would have been dressed identically to the bride,
Mhm.
also wearing veils, so that again, if they tried to run away from, there was a lot of people running away from weddings, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah, it seemed like not always, wanted or under the best circumstances. Mhm.
Right.
Mhm.
But so that if the bride tried to take off, it would be hard to tell which one was her, right? Because all of
Mhm.
the bridesmaids would look like her, which is why often it would be your sisters as well that even looked
Mhm.
more like you.
Mhm.
But we talk about that. We talk about walking down the aisle, right? This is quite literally the handing off of the bride,
Mhm.
which in some of our ancient cultures, we're seeing this as a property exchange. In others, we're actually seeing it deeper, more spiritually, because
Mhm.
the father is seen as the head of the spiritual household. And so when he's passing his daughter off, he's now giving that to the husband, right? It's his
Mhm.
job to ensure that she continues to flourish in her spiritual life. And so he's
Mhm.
sort of passing off that energy. And
Mhm.
while it does kind of ring with some patriarchal undertones, it's still also very beautiful,
Yeah.
because you're connecting to, I mean, we talk about Odin as the all father. We're connecting to this divine father, this father
Mhm.
that's looking over us and loving us. So it's not necessarily like she can't do it on her own. I'm trusting you to do it. It's
Yeah.
more like I've guided her to this
Mhm.
point, and now I'm giving you protection of her heart.
Mhm.
But those are just a few of the traditions. I mean, we could go into like carrying flowers was about, keeping warding away evil,
Mhm.
or the colors we choose to wear on our wedding day. We didn't always wear white.
Mhm.
We traditionally would have worn gold, red, or black, depending on what our intentions for our marriage were.
Oh,
So a lot of
wow.
those alt brides that are
Mhm.
choosing black, they're actually going
Mm.
back to their roots.
Yeah.
It's very woven throughout, even traditional weddings, if you will.
Mhm.
They have a lot of pagan influence.
Yeah, it's very interesting to see how some of the things, how they connect to more of maybe the transaction side and things like that, and then other things are connected deeper to the spirituality and even pagan roots, but without realizing it, without
Yeah.
any like acknowledgement of how that came to be.
Yeah, well, and
Mhm.
that's true throughout. I mean, not to take a huge scope here, but that's true throughout just human existence. There's a
Mhm.
lot of pagan influence on a lot of things that we wouldn't consider to be pagan, and so
Mhm.
I think it's intriguing to. One of my favorite stories is connecting with a couple and chatting with them, and they start out with, "We're not really religious, but we're more spiritual," and I was like,
Mhm.
That's totally fine." And then they asked me about what being a pagan was. And as I explained it to them, that it's about finding the oneness within the self, connecting to the oneness in others, connecting to nature, living through love, living through light, the
Mhm.
bride just kind of like her jaw was on the ground and she's
Mhm.
like, So I'm pagan, and
Yeah, yeah.
so, like it's kind of it's woven throughout, and
Mhm,
especially ever since the 60s and 70s when we had a wave of New Age
mhm,
paganism really kind of
mhm,
like hitting and crashing across the U.S. We have things like meditate, we have things like
mhm.
manifest that I recently posted about that these words we use all the time that
Mhm.
do have that root. We just aren't aware
Yeah.
of it. So
Yeah, and it's a much different, root and truth than is painted
yeah,
because of the politicalness, of
yeah,
it all and, like, what, I grew up thinking that word meant and how evil and everything, and then
yeah,
it's actually what you just described where a lot of people, who consider themselves spiritual would be like, "Oh, that's
yeah.
exactly, how I feel," and it's lovely, and it's beautiful, and it's natural, you know? Mhm.
Absolutely. Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
It's a word that has shifted definitions a lot over time, and
Mhm.
people have come to associate it with negative things, or they've come to associate it with not even negative, but things they don't understand. We get this
Mhm.
image of people like dancing around a bonfire, like
Mm,
in the
mhm.
woods at night, and they've like
Yeah.
sacrificed something. That's the image we get,
Mhm.
which does reflect some pagan sects.
Mhm.
But just like every religion, we all have our weirdos, right? We all have the people who took it a little further than the rest of
Mhm.
us,
Mhm.
and even that is a beautiful ritual that has
Mhm.
deep meaning. So I think kind of re-educating has been the biggest hurdle with my specific practice and what I do
Mhm.
marrying pagan people, because I
Mhm.
just have to even start by educating people on what that means.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And do you ever find that sometimes you'll get a couple where, one person understands and, like, lives by that, and that is so meaningful to them, whether or not they consider themselves pagan, but just their spirituality, and the other person not so much. Do you ever find, like, that kinda difference in weight and importance? Because I know that all the time people will ask me or comment to me, assuming that I was the person who sought out a spiritual ceremony. And how did Rob feel about that? How did I get him to do it, or did he think it was weird? Or even like my business, like how does he feel that this is what you do? I'm like, this is like my full-time
Yeah.
job. He loves it, he's into it. Also, he was the one, like I mentioned at the beginning, who even wanted specifically, I want a spiritual officiant who will get to know us, literally described to you before knowing you. So it makes me sad that that's seems to always be the assumption, this kind of one-sidedness. So I'm wondering if you ever have people who are experiencing that one-sidedness.
Oh my gosh, more often than not, actually.
Mm.
Um, I would say that out of every 10 couples that I work with, only 2 of them are both on a path.
Wow.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Oftentimes they're on different paths,
Hmm.
like I described with the witch and the Hindu, but they're
Hmm.
both still on a spiritualist path and they can connect. But more often than not, actually, I'm working with couples where it's one person who is and the other person who's not. I think for me, the biggest kind of distinction with that, because a lot of times I'll have people like, well, I don't know if you'll still work with us because we're not both pagan. That
Hmm.
doesn't bother me at all.
Yeah.
Um, where I start to kind of question and pull it apart a little bit is when I ask my couples the question, what is something that you want to learn from your partner? And the reason I do this is because I'm trying to encourage each other to look at each other and see what do they have that I don't have? What can I be kind of like aspiring to? How can I
Hmm.
be emulating them? And so the real issue for me is not necessarily that a couple, that one partner is pagan and the other's not, or spiritual and not. It's if the one who's not is using words like allow or
Hmm.
tolerate to describe
Hmm.
their relationship with their partner's spirituality.
Hmm.
Words like that in any sense in a relationship are not okay, in my opinion.
Yeah.
So if we took it out of the scope of spirituality and we just talked about, like, let's say you have a daughter and
Hmm.
you are getting married to someone and they allow or tolerate that you have a daughter, like that
Hmm.
immediately feels uncomfortable for us. We're like, that's not good for me.
Yeah.
But for some reason in our kind of in our spiritual journey, we're like, well, if I sit with it long enough, he'll start being interested, or I can change him, right? That energy.
Mm.
I can change him.
Mhm.
But I always try to point out to my couples, like, if you are existing, you're coexisting in a relationship where one of you is on a path and the other one's not, that doesn't mean you're set up for failure, as long
Mhm.
as the person who is not on that path is either neutral or
Mhm.
celebratory. Those are the
Mhm.
energies we want. So they're
Yeah.
like, yeah, I think it's really cool that they do that. I don't connect to it, but I think
Mhm.
it's really cool.
Mhm.
Or they're like, it's really awesome and I want to be a part of it, but I don't know how to get started.
Mhm.
But yeah, just that energy of allow or tolerate, it's very demeaning energy. And
Yeah.
and I try to point it out to couples early on in chats. I'm like,
Mhm.
I don't know if this is a healthy connection because
Mhm.
in my opinion, your spiritual journey is so interwoven with who you are that if
Yeah.
your partner can't connect to that, then they're not
Mhm.
truly connecting to you. At least
Mm.
that's my understanding of relationships.
Yeah.
And I say that coming from, when I met my husband, I was very deep in my practice.
Mhm.
And my husband was completely neutral. He was
Mhm.
agnostic. He had been
Mhm.
raised Christian, but
Mhm.
he was like, I know there's something, I don't know what it is, but what
Mhm.
you do is cool. So I'm
Mhm.
just going to watch.
Yeah.
So, and he did. He's one
Uh-huh.
of those stories like people like to point to. They're like,
Mhm.
maybe he'll change. And
Mhm.
sometimes they do. Um,
Mhm.
but I think it's also important to remember that, what we practice, no matter what you practice, if you practice in spirituality or paganism, you're in a non-proselytizing faith. So you are
Mhm.
not trying to convert. And
Mhm.
your relationship should not become about trying to convert your partner. So
Yes.
that's why I was trying to point it out early on
Mhm.
with what can you learn from them? Is this person willing to grow with you, or do they
Mhm.
see themselves as a complete project?
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, and, like, vice versa with the, he like, your husband, for example, he even though it was, like, the example of, "Oh, he changed,"
he did.
but he
Yeah.
started as neutral. He didn't start as, like, "Oh, well, I just deal with her and her things," you know?
Yeah, he did. He
Mhm.
started very neutral, and honestly, I would say that Philip was pagan curious.
Yeah.
I like that term. And there's a great book if you're first getting started called that too.
Oh my gosh, I love it.
Yeah, but he was pagan curious because on
Mhm,
our first meeting, or our first date, even, I said to him, I was like, and this is how I said it. I said, "How do you feel about religion?"
mhm,
And he said, I was raised really religiously, and I don't want to say that I don't feel that there's something deeper. I don't
mhm,
want to say I don't feel that there's divine, but I don't think I can connect to religion that's corrupt. So he was
mhm,
already on a path of trying to find a way to connect. He
mhm.
just didn't, like most of the people I work with, know what the word pagan meant.
Yeah,
Yeah.
mhm,
So in some ways, it wasn't even really a like I introduced him to it. It was
mhm.
more of I just told him what he was already doing.
Yeah, that's how
Yeah.
I feel with Rob about the introducing. Because when we first met, he grew up Catholic and he would consider himself atheist when we first
Yeah.
met, and never spoke to me about it, because, like, I saw it just on his profile because we met on Bumble and you put, like, your religious preferences and stuff,
Yeah.
and then we met and I never, like, talked and taught about what I do and, like, my spiritual approach. Like you said, it's not you don't, try to, like, convert anyone. That's not on your rate. That's not what you're here to do. So, like, I never really even mentioned a lot. I was just, like, being myself, and he he told me that, like, immediately after meeting me, like, almost like the first time we met, he believed in souls just from meeting me because, like, he felt his soul, and, like, ever since then, like, has been the one who wants to, like, offer to guide us in meditation and, like, ask me to Reiki attune him and, like, started doing yoga and all these things that, like, even things that I wasn't doing, like, I wasn't going to yoga, and things like that. So it's really interesting how, like, it's that connection within yourself, that can come up, and I tell that to people when they assume, that they have to only be with someone who might just, like, tolerate or allow their spirituality. I feel like a lot of that might come from too, not just thinking that someone else can change, but also thinking that that's just the majority. Like that the
Mhm.
majority of people think that this is weird.
Yeah.
Not a lot of people do this. No one really gets it. So, like, if I'm gonna be with someone, whether I'm with someone now or, like, potentially as I date people, like, I'm okay with tolerating or dealing with it. But I feel like maybe if they understood that there are other options and they could actually have a preference, and like
Yeah.
they really knew that like that was totally possible, and not just possible but um like easy, quote unquote, like when
Yeah.
you find the right person, like it's not like you're searching for that person who's spiritual and also checks off the other boxes, that that was like a total option. I feel
Yeah.
like if people really understood that, they may feel differently about saying like, oh, as long as they like deal with it, then that's fine. I feel like
Yeah.
it's almost setting yourself short, you know?
I 100% agree with that.
Mhm,
And I talk about this a lot because I also do, I'm an astrologer, right? And I
mhm,
talk about this with astrology with my couples because a lot of times they'll ask me, like, well, are we compatible? Is the first question that they want to deliver and discuss. And that question is very short-sighted in the same sense of like, I can settle for this person who's allowing.
mhm,
Because like the compatibility, if you will, of human beings is how much are you willing to challenge each other? How much are you willing
mhm,
to work through each other? Because you can have relationships that are extremely karmic and you're constantly challenging each other and they're very difficult and they might be what we would consider to be negative relationships, but it's really that they're just working through a lot.
mhm,
Or you can have, you can have like the whole breadth in between, and then you can have the relationship where you guys are kind of just on vacation down here together. You know what I mean? Like
mhm, yeah,
you're not serving karma, you're just
mhm,
hanging out. And maybe
mhm,
you're serving karma through some other relationship.
mhm,
And I feel like you're absolutely right. For some reason, we exist in this understanding that like what we do is weird and we have to kind of be ashamed of it, or we have to try to
mhm,
convince people. And someone recently asked me that. They were like, do you feel like you're a voice for a minority? And I said, absolutely not. I feel like I'm a voice for a silent majority. I
mm,
believe there are more of us out here who are on this kind of spiritual pagan spectrum of
mhm,
connecting to love and light and nature rather than being in a specific kind of like one vein of religion
mhm,
than the opposite. And so
mhm,
I feel like if you're really willing to put yourself out there, you can connect more to people that are
mm,
going to help with your karmic journey as opposed to you just helping with theirs. And I guess what I mean by that is when you're attaching to somebody that is allowing or tolerating, like you're teaching them, you're helping them, but there's nothing happening for you. So the
mhm,
relationship is very one-sided. Still doesn't mean
yeah,
it's not a good one. You might be in love with this person,
mhm,
but the relationship isn't really serving you and your
mhm,
higher self, which is ultimately, in my opinion, what they're kind of meant to do. Uh,
yeah.
you
Where
know,
that's where that two-way street really comes in, even with spirituality, that's
yeah,
where kind of quote unquote on paper, and like, is this, a back and forth where you're both putting in this kind of work and understanding of each other, and or are you just always trying to understand that person and where they're coming from, and what they believe, and not feeling like you're getting that kind of understanding in return.
that's
Mhm.
been such a journey for me. With I consider myself kind of obsessed with love,
Mhm.
and not in a romanticized way,
Mhm.
in a genuinely connecting to how human beings can be in the same space emotionally
Mhm.
way.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, and that's been my big journey. I'm very open about this on my page. I'm
Mhm.
previously married. I'm
Mhm.
divorced. And in my previous marriage, there was absolutely nothing wrong with us. We were very good friends. We got along very well. However, on our spiritual paths, our spiritual journeys, we were what you would hear in the Bible referred to as the ox and the
Mhm.
donkey, right? Like we were going in
Mhm.
different directions.
Mhm.
And because of that, we were holding each other back, you know?
Mhm.
And something that I feel is important to remind people is when you're seeking a relationship, you are seeking a vehicle that you
Mhm.
plan to be in for the majority, if not your entire life in most cases, that is going to educate you on who you are and who you're becoming and how you can reach to whatever your version of higher self, divine, afterlife, whatever that is.
Mhm.
So if your partner is not in that wave with you,
Mhm.
then they're just kind of an anchor pulling you back.
Yeah.
And you can absolutely, I have it tattooed on me. You can
Mhm.
absolutely love somebody
Mhm.
and not be meant to spend your entire life loving said person. Like you can
Mhm.
absolutely be in a space of learning from and loving someone and then move on from that. Me and my ex-husband are best friends. We talk all the time.
Yeah.
We
Mhm.
just weren't meant to be a spouse, you know?
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
that's something I encourage a lot of my couples, that it's
Mhm.
like you guys are not going in the same direction. You are very good friends,
Mhm.
but that's kind of where that energy stops, because marriage is a vehicle for self betterment and strength and growing, which you can't do if you're not both going towards the same goal.
Yeah, I love that. I appreciate that so much because I feel like I'm the only one kind of tooting this horn, or the only one I've really heard. But people, when they talk to me about dating and relationships, like all the time, I get a lot of the same focuses of like we have these things in common, and stuff like that. And I'm like, that's cool. Like,
Um,
love that. But
yeah,
also, like my biggest thing, at least for me and a lot of people that I see, 'cause a lot of people that I see are, they're sensitive souls, they're intuitive, or they're working with these things where deep down they are, and they're here for growth, right? And
yeah,
I'm like, growth is the biggest thing. Like, does this person like to grow? Do they want to grow? Because
yeah,
not everyone does. A lot of people don't. Like, they genuinely don't want to or are afraid. That's not their priority. Some people avoid it at all costs. So like I'm so big on like, does this person want to grow? And like, do they actually, like, have they ever mentioned that? Like, would that come organically from them saying that and showing that,
yeah,
not just you kind of trying to get them to say that that's what they want to. But that's huge. Like when people ask about like me and Rob, I'm like, that was the biggest thing that just clicked. It was like this person talked about how much they love to grow, so they love challenges. Give him a fight, give him an argument. He's down because he's going to learn about like what he could do better next time, and he will actually do it and implement it and be better and will be happier. And
yeah,
like I feel like that's where that long lasting like evolution and expansion comes from.
yeah.
So I love that you mentioned that because I was going to ask you, and you can answer even more specifically, is like, are there things that come up that show you in couples in a positive way where you're like, oh, like these would be things that are just reassuring. You see so many couples that things like, maybe both like how I say prioritizing growth, or you might have some other examples that you just feel like really like reassure and kind of validate like this connection.
Oh my gosh,
Hmm.
that's a fantastic answer.
Yeah.
So yes, I want to build on what you said, and then I'm going to
Mhm.
answer your question.
Yeah.
But
Hmm.
you were talking about how we're kind of both out here tooting this horn, right? Of like,
Yeah.
I'm glad you have something in common, but that's
Hmm.
not enough. Um,
Hmm.
and I talk about this a lot with people because I will occasionally meet with couples and I'll ask them, what their favorite things to do together are. And they'll talk about a shared love of a specific fandom, right? Like Marvel
Hmm.
or Lord of the Rings. So they'll talk about a shared love of a type of music, or
Hmm.
they go to a lot of concerts together. And what they're doing there is they're describing their friendship, but they're not describing their
Hmm.
relationship.
Hmm.
And so I like to draw this kind of distinction by asking deeper questions that remind you that having something in common with your partner is fantastic.
Hmm.
However, the relationship actually exists in the places where you're different,
Hmm.
not in the places that you have things in common like that, like
Hmm.
music and fandoms and stuff like that. And one of the things that I'll tell my couples too is if you were to put me and my husband on paper side by side, you would never have guessed that we'd end up together. Like if
Hmm.
we joke all the time that if we had met on like a dating app, we would have never swiped on each other
Hmm.
because we don't describe ourselves or have things about ourselves that are in common
Hmm.
at all. We're
Hmm.
very opposing people.
Hmm.
But what we have in common is, and this is bringing back to your question, this urge to change, this urge to grow, and at the very base, what makes us successful is we both have assigned the same or similar meaning to life,
Yeah.
which is the question that I will ask my couples eventually
Hmm.
with asking them what is something that you feel you've learned through being in this relationship.
Hmm.
So the goal there is to point out, are you moving towards your life goals here through this relationship? And my answer to the question being that I'm a person who feels very deeply. I'm a person who's been accused of being very dramatic. You talked about your the people you work with being very intuitive, right? We often get accused of being emotional, dramatic, sensitive, right?
Hmm.
And what I've learned through my relationship is that that's not a bad thing, that
Hmm.
that is my strength. And
Yeah.
so, what my husband and I have in common with this assigning meaning to life is connecting to the parts of ourself that might be considered shadow and
Hmm.
seeing them as strength. And
Hmm.
because we have that shared meaning to life, connecting to every part of ourself, it doesn't matter if we don't like the same music or the
Yeah.
same food, or, like none of that matters
Yeah.
because life is what matters to us
Hmm.
together. And so I just listen to my music by myself, and he
Hmm.
gets the food he wants when he wants it, and
Yeah.
it's okay.
Right?
So,
Yes.
which is not to say that you shouldn't have those things in common,
Hmm.
like we do have a few things that we love and
Hmm.
share. But ultimately, at the end of the day, your relationship success is going to be built on, are you moving towards the same goal?
Mhm.
So when I meet with my couples and I see them, being able to, the most physically obvious thing
Mhm.
is to complete each other's sentences. When they are able
Mm.
to communicate in duo without
Mhm.
interrupting each other, that is a really positive sign that they already communicate very strongly
Mhm.
together through situations that confuse them. Because oftentimes this is a
Mhm.
question that's overwhelming or confusing or uncomfortable. One of the questions that I ask my couples is, how do you work through disagreements? And that
Mhm.
is a very like vulnerable
Mhm.
answer, right? And the fact that they can kind of call and response answer that
Mhm.
shows that they are comfortable dealing with challenges and moving together, versus you get couples that kind of like stare into the screen and they're like, well, I don't know, we just kind of talk about it till it's done. So
Yeah.
really that ability to explore. And then beyond that, I think the healthiest thing I see in my couples is their ability to make each other laugh, to give each other
Mm.
joy,
Mhm.
even when discussing hard things, their ability to keep each other happy. That is
Mhm.
that is showing that they value each other's joy above everything.
Yeah. And I
Yeah.
love what's coming to mind too is like these things that you're mentioning and that I mentioned too, like they aren't so much this like checklist on paper in a very
Yeah.
like objective way. Like it's not like this person is like a character and they have certain like traits. It's very much like within this dynamic, like how this shows up and like that third entity of the relationship and like what that is and like if it's flourishing and if it is able to ebb and flow and grow and all of these things. So it's not necessarily like I'll tell people I'm about like looking deeper, and then people will sometimes think that deeper means that you like ask about their family or something. And I'm like, that's still technically like this is still
That's that's still very
superficial.
shallow.
This is
Yeah.
still like superficial, you
Yeah.
know? Like, oh, like what are your favorite books? And I'm like,
Yeah.
this is
Yeah.
still superficial. Like, and like you said, that's awesome. There's like that friendship aspect. But as far as like something that's really lasting and flourishing and growing, there's that those deeper like aspects to it. And I
Yeah.
feel like that's huge and not a lot of people understand how to really feel that for themselves,
Mhm.
intuitively in somebody and also be able to even understand in the first place that that is what like should be felt and sought for, not just like these things that you like that you have in common or yeah, and just
Yeah.
things on those other levels.
Absolutely. And I think too, a lot of that comes from how we're socialized. Not to make it a huge scope, but it definitely is it's a socialization where we're taught to look for people that we have things in common with. We feel
Mm,
safer with people that
yeah.
we have things in common with.
Hmm.
And ultimately, love isn't safe,
Mm,
right? Love
yeah.
is trusting somebody
Hmm.
to be vulnerable with them, and
Hmm.
then in turn they give you safety. But love itself it's very it's
Yeah.
definitely a risk, right?
Hmm.
And so a lot of times when I'm talking to because I do talk to couples and I'll get to know them and I'll start working with them, and it's not every time, but at least 5 times over the course of my career I
Hmm.
have had couples that as a result of working with me have decided they're not ready for marriage.
Hmm.
And I think some people in my position might see that as a failure. I see it as a
No, I was gonna say that's
success.
great.
Yeah, I see it as a success,
Yeah.
because 3 of those 5 have reached back out to me later and then been ready to get married. And then 2 of
Oh.
them were like, we're good friends, but we're not good for each other." And
Hmm.
so this journey, I think of like meeting and getting to know my couples, it
Hmm.
provides them with that as well as like I'm not trying to decide if I think you're good for each other, but I
Hmm.
am going to pose the questions that get you to decide that. Because I
Yeah.
think a lot of times when we're falling in love, and I'm a romantic,
Hmm.
but when we're falling in love, we're so taken with this person that
Hmm.
we often forget to ask those important questions,
Hmm.
or we don't know how to, because
Hmm.
we're kind of taught that it's too forward, right?
Hmm.
And you can ask my husband, he likes to joke about it on our first date. I was very forward.
Hmm.
I asked him like straight out, I was like, how do you feel about family? How do you feel
Hmm.
about religion?
Hmm.
I asked him, I was like, what's something that you did that looking back, you can't believe you did it? Like,
Uh,
what are, so I think too, this is also about asking the right questions, right?
mhm.
Of our partner. And
Yeah.
occasionally you get someone who's like, well, I'm a little nervous to ask him that. And I
Mhm,
think you could say this from your marriage too. If you're too nervous to ask him that, then you don't have the vulnerability and
mhm.
trust in one another to be in a long-term relationship.
Yeah.
You get to a point in these relationships where you are quite literally going to handle everything together. So
Mhm,
no question should be uncomfortable. Every
mhm,
question should be allowed. And I've looked at my husband and asked him what is he most ashamed of in his
mhm.
life, you know,
Yeah.
and his ability to ask that of me in return and me respond.
Mhm.
I feel like that's really what we're looking for here when we're talking about deep intentional relationships. Like if we're just
Yeah.
trying to have fun, like go for
Mhm.
it.
Yeah.
But if you're
Mhm,
really looking for someone you're going to spend your life
mhm,
with, it's beyond
mhm,
just what's your favorite music,
mhm,
are you close with your mom, and
mhm.
what's your career. Like none of that matters to
Yeah.
marriage at all,
Mhm.
you know,
It
because
all changes.
it
Any of
is.
those things could change, like, even your, like, hobbies and things that you like to do, the shows that you like to watch, all of those things can change, so it's hard to make those things your anchor, and I feel like it's important to have your anchor be the fluctuation itself, that, like, are you okay with change, and how do you handle that, and how do you move? Like, how do you move? Like, not how do you stay the same, And it's like, how do we stay the same and how do we stay exactly as we are? Like that can't last because things have to change. So I feel like the stability needs to be in like how do we like move, you
Yeah.
know?
Yeah.
Yeah. Mhm.
Absolutely, because, you know, the analogy that I use here is you can't look at a pine cone and know what the
Mm.
tree will look like. Um,
Mm.
and so when it comes to like relationships and interpersonal relationships, especially marriage relationships, what we're looking for here is that vehicle growth, that vehicle of change, and is this person willing and capable? You know, there was a lot of things that my husband had been raised to believe and think, and he had never been exposed to anything else. He didn't go to college. He
Mhm.
had just barely moved out of living with his parents when we met. And so he had a lot of things he was coming into our marriage or into our early relationship with that I would not have been okay with in our marriage.
Mhm.
They evolved over the course of our early relationship. And then it was like, okay, marriage is definitely a possibility. But there
Mhm.
is another alternative reality where
Mhm.
we didn't evolve, right? Where
Mhm.
we didn't grow. And so the marriage was not the next step. And I think
Yeah.
that's an important thing to also consider is just because you love someone, just because you are working well with them doesn't mean that you would be good in that. Like just because the pine cone looks good doesn't mean the tree will. Like
Yeah.
you have to trust
Mhm.
you have to trust each other to grow and change, and you have to
Mhm.
challenge each other to do so.
Mhm.
And it really, I mean, every day is a new day, right? And we never know
Mhm.
who we're going to be, but we've at least made the promise that we're going to be it together,
Mhm.
you know?
Yeah. I love that. Well, I mean, I could talk to you all day,
Yeah.
but I know that we want to make sure that this is in a reasonable amount of time for the podcast. I know that I got to be taken off, so I would love for you to share what you're up to. I know you have a new venture, how to find you, what's going on with you, and how you will see couples.
Oh my gosh, yes.
Mhm,
Big ventures. So
mhm,
I had right around the time that the two of you booked me, I had opened up my business to be a national business. So I marry
mhm,
people all across the U.S., not just in Colorado. And I'm going to some very tiny towns in the middle of nowhere in
mhm,
Alabama. That doesn't mean just in LA, you know?
mhm.
But that is actually only until November of this year. My husband and I are moving to Scotland. I know it's so very exciting. We've long wanted to move to Europe, and the
Mhm,
opportunity just presented itself. So
mhm,
I am just trying to be a part of as many love stories as I can in the
mhm,
US before moving to Scotland. And then I will actually be continuing the business there as well for
mhm,
either if couples want to bring me back to the US or if they
mhm.
want to come and elope with me in Scotland because
Wow.
they want to get married in Scotland.
Yeah.
So,
Especially the pagans.
oh my gosh, I know. I mean, it is the birthplace of the Celtic culture, and
Yeah.
the hand fasting is very deeply rooted there. So I'm
Mhm.
very much looking forward to reconnecting to that. As part of that, I'm also going to be joining a Druidic priestess order. Uh,
Mhm.
Towards an actual priestessship through the Druidic order. So that'll be a very fun thing to be able to connect to as well. And I hope to share more of that journey and educate more with that.
Mhm.
But that's what I'm up to right now is just
Mhm.
figuring out this transition as we just talked about that growth and change,
Mhm.
not only in my business life but in my personal life, what it looks
Mhm.
like. A lot of moving pieces.
Yeah.
But yeah, absolutely as many love stories as I can be a part of here before
Mhm,
going there in whatever form or fashion. I don't just
mhm,
marry people. I do
mhm,
renewals, I do commitment ceremonies for couples that
mhm,
don't believe in legal marriage. They just want to
mhm,
commit to one another. So whatever form or fashion, I'm
mhm.
just excited to be a part of them all.
Yeah, that's amazing. I love how you have the different options and like really honor and celebrate that like this is about the marriage and the union and it can be in whatever capacity like that means to you because it doesn't have to involve the legal system and definitely. Yeah, I would love for people to find you. I can vouch, like I said, she was our officiant and literally created the most incredible, personal, intentional ceremony that just was perfect for us specifically. So yeah, how can people find you?
Oh my gosh, all over the place. Like you mentioned, Instagram at
Mhm,
letbeloved.co. That's BEE as in bzz, the bug bee.
mhm,
Of course, I do have a huge TikTok presence as well.
mhm,
So you can also find me on TikTok at Let There Be Love. And then if you go directly to my website, www.lettherebelove.com, you can also reach out to me personally through the
mhm,
contact form and we can start talking about your ceremony, your
mhm,
script. And like I said, even if you're choosing to have your ceremony after I move, I'm happy to come back. Or I am offering now mentorships where I will
mhm,
still get to know you and write a whole script for you and then teach somebody you know or love to deliver
mhm.
it for you. So you
Oh,
can
wow.
spell even if
Uh-huh.
you live.
That's so cool. Yeah, like I'm like, listen, did you hear that? Did you guys? She will literally help create your whole ceremony, even if it means her not being there and not passing that on to someone else, maybe like a family member or friend, if that's more accessible to those looking for still a sacred and intimate, intentional ceremony. Cool. So I will drop all of your info in the show notes. You can go follow along. You can find all of her info and reach out. And then for me, I just wanted to let you all know, as we are on the subject of love and relationships, I have my program, Love and Happiness, out right now. Love and Happiness is all about the deeper work that me and Liv have been talking about. Whether you are single or dating or in a relationship and wherever that relationship is, the work is very personal to you and going into like what are your patterns, what are your subconscious ways of showing up and receiving the experiences that you are and how to start changing that experience into what you really want it to be. Again, whether that's if you're single, if you're with someone and figuring it out, anything under the sun, because this is a personal journey to you. But definitely check out my Love and Happiness program. There's only a limited spots available. So I would definitely check that out in the link in bio and see if I am the person to help you with your love and happiness journey.
Absolutely. I hope everybody finds you, Alex, and then I hope when they're done working with you, they find me. We could just create
Yes.
a little.
Just back I was gonna say that too, is that, like, it'd be perfect. I would love to end up referring my people from Love and Happiness, which reminds me too, you can sign up as an individual, whether you're single or in a relationship. And if you're in a relationship and both parties are wanting this kind of work and wanting to grow, which we love, you can also sign up as a couple. So I'll have that information there as well. So you can both get your individual and couples coaching in the program. And yeah, I'd love to then refer you to Liv with this happy, magical ending and vice versa. I
Yeah,
love the way that Liv gets so deep with couples, and is able to see like so much of the relationship. She's in such an intimate place with them and be able to have a referral for anyone who is like needing more of that deeper work and help.
definitely, Alex. I will be sending you some couples for
Mhm.
sure.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Well, this is a dynamic duo. I love it. Thank you so much for being here. It's been an honor having your like knowledge and just like your energetic presence. So I'm so happy that we were able to do this.
Thank you, Alex. It was so nice to reconnect with you and talk about so many beautiful things and kind
Mhm.
of create space together. I hope we can do this again soon.
Yeah, I'll do part two.
Good.
Awesome.
Well.
Well, thank you all for listening in, and I hope you all have a sunny day and be well. Thank you for tuning in to the Sunny Days podcast. Don't forget to subscribe and catch more of my free content by following me at Alex the Good Witch on Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube. If this episode resonated with you, please take a screenshot, post it in your stories, and tag me on Instagram. I appreciate your time here with me today. Peace and love to you all, and I will see you in the next episode.